Los Angeles has become completely unaffordable for ordinary people, and what happened to this city reveals something deeply troubling about the American dream itself. Once upon a time, Los Angeles was the place where dreams came true, where a waitress could become a star, where a struggling artist could rent a studio apartment near the beach for $200 a month, where families could own homes with front yards and swimming pools on a single income. But today, the median home price has exploded past $900,000. One-bedroom apartments rent for $3,000 in neighborhoods that were once considered affordable. And the middle class is vanishing so fast that economists are calling it an extinction event. This is not just about housing costs. This is about the systematic dismantling of opportunity itself. And by the end of this story, you will understand exactly who profited while everyone else lost everything. What really happened to the City of Dreams is darker than anyone wants to admit, and the forces that destroyed Los Angeles affordability are now spreading to every major city in America. Let me take you back to 1970, when Los Angeles still kept its promises. Back then, a public school teacher could buy a 3-bedroom house in West Hollywood for $35,000. A young couple working regular jobs could afford a bungalow in Silver Lake with money left over for vacations. Venice Beach was full of artists and musicians living in cottages steps from the ocean. The city hummed with creative energy because people had breathing room. They had time to dream. They had space to fail and try again. Everyone remembers the golden light of those California afternoons, the sense that anything was possible, the feeling that Los Angeles belonged to dreamers and strivers, not just millionaires and moguls. Families planted orange trees in their backyards. Neighbors knew each other's names. The city felt alive with possibility because ordinary people could actually afford to live there. Hollywood Boulevard sparkled with theaters and diners, where struggling actors served coffee during the day and rehearsed scenes at night. Downtown was rough around the edges, but filled with affordable lofts, where artists turned industrial spaces into galleries and studios. Santa Monica had modest apartment buildings where writers typed screenplays overlooking the Pacific without spending their entire paycheck on rent. This was the Los Angeles that welcomed immigrants, that rewarded hard work, that turned nobodies into somebodies. This was the city that promised if you showed up with talent and determination, you would find your chance. And for decades, that promise held true. Then something shifted, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, like watching the tide go out over years instead of hours. During the 1980s, foreign investment began pouring into Los Angeles real estate as wealthy buyers from Asia and Europe discovered California property as a safe place to park money. Luxury developments started replacing working-class neighborhoods. The city began marketing itself not as a place for dreamers, but as a brand, a lifestyle, an investment opportunity. Politicians and developers sought dollar signs where families once saw homes. Zoning laws favored expensive single-family houses over affordable apartments. Construction of new housing slowed to a crawl just as the population continued growing. Every year, demand increased while supply stagnated, and anyone who understood basic economics could see what was coming next. But the people making decisions either did not care or actively wanted prices to rise because they owned property themselves and benefited from appreciation. Homeowners became a powerful political bloc that fought against any new construction in their neighborhoods, hiding behind environmental concerns and historical preservation while really just protecting their own property values. The seed of the crisis was planted, and it was watered by greed dressed up as civic responsibility. By the 2000s, the transformation had accelerated into something undeniable. Hollywood was no longer affordable for actors unless they had family money or multiple roommates. Venice Beach cottages that housed poets and painters were demolished to build modern mansions for tech executives. Silver Lake bungalows that once cost $200,000 were suddenly selling for $1 million. The artist class, the service workers, the teachers and firefighters and nurses, they all started getting pushed further and further from the city center, forced into hour-long commutes from Palmdale or Riverside just to work jobs in Los Angeles they could no longer afford to live near. You started seeing 20 people sharing a single-family home, sleeping in shifts, sacrificing every shred of privacy just to stay in the city. But even that was not enough for many. Families who had lived in Los Angeles for generations began leaving, priced out by property taxes that skyrocketed alongside home values even when they already owned their houses. The city was gentrifying itself into irrelevance, becoming a playground for the wealthy while everyone else scrambled for scraps. Then came the 2008 financial crisis, and for a brief moment, it looked like the bubble might burst and bring some relief. Home prices dropped, foreclosures flooded the market, and people dared to hope that affordability might return. But that is not what happened. Instead, Wall Street investment firms swooped in with billions in cash and bought up thousands of foreclosed homes at bargain prices, converting them into rental properties and creating a permanent landlord class of corporate entities that had no interest in keeping rents affordable. Regular people were outbid at every turn by all-cash offers from faceless LLCs. The crisis that should have reset the market instead concentrated ownership in the hands of the few. By 2010, those same investment firms were raising rents aggressively, squeezing maximum profit from families who had lost their chance to buy and now had no choice but to rent at whatever price the market demanded. Private equity discovered that residential real estate could generate returns that rivaled tech stocks, and Los Angeles became one of their favorite hunting grounds. The financialization of housing had begun, turning shelter into an asset class, and ordinary people never stood a chance against institutional money. At the same time, a new gold rush was transforming the city's economy and culture. Silicon Beach emerged in Santa Monica and Venice, bringing an influx of tech workers with salaries that made even inflated Los Angeles rents look manageable to them, but catastrophic for everyone else. A software engineer making $200,000 could easily pay $4,000 a month for a one-bedroom, which meant landlords could charge $4,000, which meant school teachers making $60,000 could no longer compete. Luxury apartment towers sprouted across the West Side, with amenities like rooftop pools and yoga studios and dog spas, all marketed to young tech professionals who treated Los Angeles like a temporary playground before moving on to their next adventure. These buildings sat half empty at the beginning because the rents were so obscene, but developers did not care, because they were banking on long-term appreciation and foreign investment buyers who purchased units as assets, not homes. Entire blocks of downtown were transformed into sleek residential towers with ground-floor retail that only sold $15 smoothies and $70 yoga pants. The city was being redesigned for people who could afford to treat money casually, and everyone else was just in the way. Meanwhile, the homelessness crisis exploded into something that shocked even longtime residents. By 2015, tent encampments lined entire streets in neighborhoods that had once been solidly middle class. Skid Row expanded beyond its traditional boundaries, spilling into the arts district and nearby areas. People who had worked full-time jobs found themselves living in cars because they could not afford both rent and food. Families with children slept in vehicles parked in Walmart lots. The visible face of the affordability crisis was everywhere, impossible to ignore, a daily reminder that the city had failed its most vulnerable. Yet the political response was paralyzed by competing interests and ideological battles about whether housing should be treated as a right or a commodity. Billions were spent on services and shelters, but without addressing the root cause of unaffordable housing, the crisis only deepened. Every solution proposed was blocked by someone. Homeowners did not want shelters in their neighborhoods. Progressives fought against any involvement of private developers. Developers wanted subsidies without rent restrictions, and nothing substantive ever got built. The city talked endlessly about compassion while people died on the streets, and the hypocrisy was suffocating. Then, the pandemic arrived in 2020, and it ripped away any remaining illusions about Los Angeles as a city of opportunity. When the world shut down, millions lost their jobs and income, but rents did not drop proportionally because landlords knew eviction moratoriums would eventually end, and they could afford to wait. Remote work allowed high earners to leave expensive offices but stay in expensive neighborhoods, further driving up housing costs in areas that had been more affordable. People who had been hanging on by their fingernails lost their grip entirely. Eviction courts became overwhelmed the moment moratoriums lifted. Stories circulated of families who had lived in the same apartment for 20 years being forced out so landlords could renovate and double the rent. A school teacher in Echo Park received an eviction notice after 15 years because her landlord wanted to convert the building into luxury units. A construction worker in Van Nuys found himself homeless despite working 50 hours a week because he could not save enough for first and last month's rent plus deposit anywhere within commuting distance of his job. An elderly couple in Koreatown who had run a small grocery store for 30 years had to close because their commercial rent tripled and their customers, all longtime neighbors, could no longer afford to live in the area. These were not statistics, these were people whose lives were being destroyed by market forces that treated them as obstacles to profit maximization rather than human beings deserving of dignity and stability. The city hemorrhaged residents, with more people leaving Los Angeles County than arriving for the first time in decades. But even that exodus did not bring prices down significantly because the people leaving were the ones who could not afford to stay, while wealthy buyers kept pushing prices higher in desirable neighborhoods. Venture capitalists working from home in Malibu bid up beach properties. Entertainment executives fleeing crowded West Side neighborhoods bought estates in the hills. Technology entrepreneurs from the Bay Area relocated to Los Angeles because it suddenly seemed cheap compared to San Francisco, bringing their inflated salary expectations and outbidding locals at every turn. The pandemic reshuffled the deck but kept dealing winning hands to people who already had money while everyone else watched their cards get worse. Restaurants that had served communities for generations closed permanently, unable to afford rent without indoor dining revenue. Independent bookstores and record shops, already struggling against online retail, could not survive the double blow of reduced foot traffic and rising lease costs. The cultural ecosystem that made Los Angeles interesting was collapsing, leaving behind a sanitized corporate landscape of chain stores and sterile luxury apartments. The pandemic revealed that Los Angeles affordability was not just strained, it was fundamentally broken, and no temporary relief measure could fix structural rot. By 2023, the statistics painted a portrait of a city in crisis. The median rent for a one-bedroom apartment had reached $2,500, meaning a renter needed to earn at least $100,000 annually to follow the standard rule of spending no more than 30% of income on housing. But the median household income in Los Angeles was only $70,000. The math simply did not work for more than half the population. Homeownership had become a fantasy for anyone who did not already have wealth or family help with a down payment. A typical home required a down payment of nearly $200,000, an amount that would take decades to save for someone earning an average salary. The American dream of building wealth through home ownership was dead for an entire generation in Los Angeles, replaced by a permanent renter class that would spend their entire lives making landlords rich while building no equity of their own. But here is what makes this story even darker. The people who owned property in Los Angeles were getting wealthier by the day, watching their home values climb into the millions without lifting a finger, while their neighbors who rented fell further behind with every passing year. The wealth gap exploded into a chasm. Homeowners voted for policies that restricted new housing construction because they wanted their property values to keep rising. They showed up at city council meetings to oppose apartment buildings and density, using coded language about neighborhood character and traffic concerns. But everyone knew what they really meant. They did not want poor people nearby, and they definitely did not want anything that might slow their home equity growth. The system rewarded selfishness and punished compassion. Politicians were captured by real estate interests who donated heavily to campaigns and lobbied for favorable zoning laws. The construction industry was slow and expensive, hampered by regulations that added years and millions to every project, making it nearly impossible to build anything affordable. And when affordable housing did get approved, it cost $800,000 per unit to build, which was so absurdly expensive that it would have been cheaper to just give people money for down payments. But that solution was never seriously considered because it did not enrich the right people. Underneath all of this, a deeper rot had infected the city. Los Angeles had given up on being a place for everyone and instead embraced being a luxury brand. City leadership marketed Los Angeles to wealthy tourists and investors while ignoring the needs of working-class residents. Downtown was transformed into a sanitized playground with expensive restaurants and cocktail bars, pricing out the very people who had lived there through the tough decades when downtown was gritty and dangerous. The Arts District, once a haven for actual artists, became a destination for Instagram influencers, posing in front of colorful murals. Highland Park and Boyle Heights, historically Latino neighborhoods, faced relentless gentrification as white newcomers moved in and drove up rents until longtime residents could not afford to stay. The city was being colonized by people who had money and wanted authenticity as an aesthetic, but had no interest in the actual community or culture they were displacing. Los Angeles was becoming a monoculture of wealth, and the diversity and creativity that had once defined the city were being systematically erased by market forces that valued profit over people. And the truly infuriating part is that none of this was inevitable. Los Angeles did not have to become unaffordable. Cities like Tokyo and Vienna have proven that it is possible to build enough housing to keep prices reasonable even with growing populations and thriving economies. But that requires political will and a commitment to treating housing as a necessity rather than an investment vehicle. Los Angeles made different choices. At every critical juncture over the past 50 years, the city chose to protect property values instead of people, to favor homeowners over renters, to prioritize developer profits over community needs, to let market forces run wild instead of imposing reasonable regulations that would ensure affordability. The crisis was not caused by some mysterious economic forces beyond anyone's control. It was caused by specific policy decisions made by specific people who benefited from those decisions while others suffered. The affordability crisis in Los Angeles is not a tragedy, it is a crime scene, and the perpetrators are still walking free, still making decisions, still profiting. Now, in 2025, the situation has reached a breaking point. Teachers are leaving the profession because they cannot afford to live in the districts where they work. Firefighters and police officers commute 2 hours each way because they have been priced out of the city they serve. Small businesses are closing because they cannot find workers who can afford to live nearby. The cultural institutions that made Los Angeles special are disappearing, replaced by chains that can afford high rents. The neighborhoods that once had soul are becoming sterile, filled with expensive apartments that sit vacant because even at high prices, they are still considered good investments by foreign buyers who never intend to live in them. Los Angeles is eating itself, devouring the very things that made it worth living in. The city of dreams has become the city of greed. You have probably felt this change too, even if you have never lived in Los Angeles. Maybe you have watched your own city follow the same pattern, seen rents climb while wages stagnate, noticed that the places you loved got replaced. What happened to Los Angeles is happening everywhere because the same forces are at work. The financialization of housing, the concentration of wealth, the political capture by real estate interests. We have built an economy where shelter has become a speculative asset, where the basic human need for a stable home has been turned into a casino game, where working hard and playing by the rules no longer guarantees you a decent life. Los Angeles is not an outlier. It is a warning. It is the logical endpoint of an economic system that treats everything as a commodity, including the places where we live and raise our families. So what can be done? Some people say nothing, that this is just how capitalism works, that market forces should determine who gets to live where. But that answer is morally bankrupt, because cities need teachers and nurses and firefighters to function. Others argue for radical solutions: rent control, public housing construction, taxes on vacant properties, zoning reform to allow density. These ideas are politically challenging, but the alternative is accepting the death of cities as places of opportunity. Solving the Los Angeles affordability crisis requires confronting powerful interests who profit from the current system. It means organizing, voting, protesting, demanding change. It means rejecting the idea that some people deserve housing while others do not. It means recognizing that a society that cannot provide affordable shelter for its working families has failed at its most basic responsibility. Empty streets where families used to play. Empty storefronts where businesses used to thrive. Empty promises where dreams used to flourish. This is what Los Angeles has become, a hollow version of itself. A city that traded its soul for property appreciation, that sacrificed community for profit margins, that chose wealth over humanity. The sunset still glows orange over the Pacific. The palm trees still sway in the breeze. The Hollywood sign still watches over the basin. But the magic is gone, because magic requires people, and the people are being driven away. What happened to Los Angeles should enrage you, because it did not have to be this way, because we had choices, because at every step we knew what the right thing to do was and we chose not to do it, because we let greed win. The city of dreams is dying, killed by indifference and avarice. And unless we learn from its slow-motion collapse, every city we love will follow the same path into unaffordability and despair. Maybe there is still hope, a fragile thread of possibility that we can reverse course before it is too late. Maybe the next generation of leaders will choose differently, will have the courage to stand up to real estate lobbies and wealthy homeowners, will prioritize people over profits. Maybe we will finally build the housing we desperately need, reform the zoning laws that strangle supply, tax the speculation that inflates prices, protect the renters who keep getting crushed. Maybe Los Angeles can remember what it used to be and fight to become that again. A place where dreams are possible because life is affordable, where creativity flourishes because artists can pay rent, where families thrive because working hard actually means something. Cities like Minneapolis have abolished single-family zoning to allow more housing density. Portland has implemented inclusionary zoning requirements that force developers to include affordable units in new buildings. Barcelona has cracked down on short-term rentals that were converting residential housing into tourist accommodations. These solutions are not perfect, but they prove that political will can create change when leaders stop protecting the interests of property owners at the expense of everyone else. Los Angeles has the resources, the talent, and the land to solve this crisis if it chooses to act. The question is whether the people in power have the courage to make hard choices that will anger wealthy constituents and real estate donors. The question is whether we as residents will demand change loudly enough and persistently enough that politicians cannot ignore us anymore. Maybe we will look back on this dark chapter as the moment we woke up and decided to do better. Or maybe we will keep sleepwalking toward a future where every great city becomes an exclusive enclave for the rich, while everyone else gets pushed to the margins, where opportunity is determined by birth and inheritance rather than talent and effort, where the American dream finally dies and we all just accept it. The signs are everywhere that we are approaching a tipping point. Teacher shortages across the city because educators cannot afford to live here. Emergency services struggling to recruit because first responders are priced out. Essential workers commuting 3 hours a day because that is the only way to keep jobs that do not pay enough to live nearby. At some point, the city stops functioning when the people who make it run can no longer afford to be there. At some point, the wealthy discover that their luxury apartments and gated communities are worthless without the teachers to educate their children, the firefighters to protect their homes, the nurses to care for them when they are sick, the workers to serve them coffee and deliver their food and fix their cars. A city cannot exist as just an investment portfolio. It needs to be a living, breathing community of people from all economic levels working together to create something greater than the sum of its parts. Los Angeles forgot that fundamental truth, and now it is paying the price in exodus and dysfunction and despair. The choice is ours, and the clock is ticking. Los Angeles is screaming its warning. But is anyone listening? If you have watched your city change in ways that break your heart, if you have felt the squeeze of rising costs and stagnant wages, if you have wondered how we got here and who let this happen, share your story in the comments. Let's build a community of people who refuse to accept that housing unaffordability is just the way things have to be. And if this opened your eyes to what is really happening across America, subscribe, because the next story goes even deeper into the forces reshaping our cities and our lives. The truth is darker than you think, but understanding it is the first step toward fighting back. The city of dreams did not die by accident. It was murdered, and it is time we started naming the killers.